Have you ever met someone who completely changed the course of your life? Someone who, with just a glance, made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Tonight, we bring you a story of love found at 30,000 feet, where fate, fear, and passion collide in the most unexpected way. Sophie, a spirited flight attendant, and Ethan, a reserved yet enigmatic pilot, share a connection that neither of them saw coming. But when the past threatens to keep them apart, will they have the courage to take a leap of faith? Buckle up, because this is a journey you won't want to miss. Destiny can take you anywhere, but love makes you stay. This is Crossed Destinies. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story like this one. If you love romance filled with passion and surprises, hit the like button and share this video with someone who enjoys a great love story. And tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that changed everything? We'd love to hear your story. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into this unforgettable journey. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a familiar rhythm that Sophie Reynolds had come to love. The steady pulse of flight had become her constant, a comforting backdrop to the ever-changing destinations her job as a flight attendant brought her to. Tonight's route was New York to Paris, and while she had worked international flights before, this was her first time assigned to Captain Ethan Carter's crew. She had heard the whispers from fellow flight attendants: strict, no nonsense, distant. "You'll be fine," said Laura, her colleague, as they finished pre-flight checks. "Just don't expect small talk. Captain Carter doesn't do friendly." Sophie simply smiled. She wasn't one to judge based on rumors. From the moment she stepped into the cockpit to introduce herself, she sensed the truth in the warnings. Ethan Carter was the embodiment of control: sharp uniform, unreadable expression, and a gaze that flickered over her with the detachment of a man who saw people as little more than moving parts in a well-oiled machine. "Miss Reynolds." His voice was even, professional. "Welcome aboard." "Thank you, Captain." She offered a warm smile, but he had already turned back to his instruments. The flight proceeded smoothly, until they hit turbulence. It started with a slight tremor, barely noticeable. Then, without warning, the plane lurched violently. Gasps filled the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled. Sophie's training kicked in. She moved swiftly, steadying a nervous passenger, offering reassurance with a calm smile. "It's just a rough patch, completely normal." In the cockpit, Ethan's hands remained steady on the controls, his voice composed as he spoke to air traffic control. But when he caught a glimpse of Sophie in the reflection of his instruments, unshaken, helping others, something unexpected stirred within him. When the turbulence finally eased, a collective sigh rippled through the cabin. Sophie made a final round, checking on passengers. Ethan stepped out briefly, his gaze sweeping the cabin. His eyes met Sophie's. For a fraction of a second, there was something there. Acknowledgement, perhaps even admiration. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment was gone. The turbulence had passed, but the air between Sophie and Ethan remained charged with something unspoken. She wasn't sure what had flickered in his gaze earlier: respect, curiosity, or maybe just a fleeting acknowledgement, but it had disappeared as quickly as it came. As the flight continued toward Paris, the crew settled into their routine. Passengers dozed off, wrapped in blankets, while the soft hum of the aircraft filled the dimly lit cabin. Sophie had just finished refilling a passenger's water when a voice crackled over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. Due to unexpected weather conditions over the Atlantic, we will be making a temporary stop in Lisbon." A murmur spread through the cabin. Sophie exchanged a glance with Laura. A delay was never ideal, but she had learned long ago that unpredictability was part of the job. When they landed at Lisbon Portela Airport, passengers were directed to wait in the terminal until conditions improved. The crew, however, was given a few hours of rest at a nearby hotel. Stepping into the warm night air, Sophie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the ocean mixed with the faint aroma of citrus from a nearby cafe. It was a refreshing change from the sterile cabin air. At the hotel lobby, Laura nudged her playfully. "We've got a few hours. Let's make the most of it. A little sightseeing, maybe?" Before Sophie could answer, a familiar voice cut through the conversation. "We should be back at the airport within 4 hours." Ethan stood near the reception desk, his posture as rigid as ever. He looked at the crew but barely acknowledged Sophie. "You're welcome to explore," he added, his tone neutral. "Just be punctual." Laura rolled her eyes. "He really needs to relax." Sophie chuckled. "Maybe he just doesn't know how." Later that evening, as the crew wandered through Lisbon's cobbled streets, Sophie caught sight of Ethan alone at a quiet cafe, a coffee in hand, his expression unreadable as he gazed out at the city. For a man who seemed so in control, there was a loneliness about him she couldn't quite place. She wasn't sure why, but something told her there was more to Captain Ethan Carter than met the eye. The streets of Lisbon were alive with the sounds of distant music and laughter. The air was warm, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor nearby. Sophie and Laura strolled along the waterfront, enjoying the unexpected break. As they turned a corner, Sophie spotted Ethan again. He was still at the cafe alone, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. It wasn't just his solitude that caught her attention. It was the way he seemed utterly disconnected from the world around him. "Are you seriously thinking about talking to him?" Laura whispered, following Sophie's gaze. "Why not?" Sophie shrugged. "He's human, just like us." Before Laura could protest, Sophie walked over. "Mind if I join you, Captain?" Ethan looked up, startled for a split second before his usual composure returned. He hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. Sophie sat down, resting her hands on the smooth wooden table. "Didn't take you for a coffee at midnight kind of guy. I don't sleep much." His voice was even, but there was a weight behind his words. Sophie tilted her head. "Because of the job? Or something else?" Ethan exhaled slowly, looking past her, toward the city lights reflecting on the river. "Both." She studied him for a moment. There was something guarded about him, as if he had spent years building walls no one dared to climb. "I used to think flying was the only place I belonged," she admitted, breaking the silence. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm just running from something I haven't figured out yet." Ethan's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Maybe we all are." For the first time since meeting him, Sophie saw a glimpse of the man behind the uniform. Not just the disciplined captain, but someone carrying burdens he didn't share. The moment didn't last long. Ethan glanced at his watch, his professional demeanor returning. "We should head back soon." As they walked toward the hotel, Sophie stole a glance at him. She had expected resistance, but instead, she had found something else, an opening, however small. And for some reason, she wasn't ready to let it close. The flight back to New York was quiet, the passengers either sleeping or lost in their own thoughts. The dim glow of the cabin lights cast soft shadows, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Sophie sat in the crew's resting area, absently stirring the tea in her cup. The conversation with Ethan in Lisbon lingered in her mind. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put into words. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Couldn't sleep either?" She looked up. Ethan stood at the entrance, his sleeves slightly rolled up, his usually precise appearance softened just a little. "Guess not," she said with a small smile. Without a word, he stepped inside, taking the seat across from her. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things unsaid. "You surprised me back in Lisbon," Ethan finally said. "Most people don't bother asking questions." Sophie tilted her head. "And you? Do you ever let anyone in?" He let out a quiet breath. "Not often." She hesitated before asking, "Why?" For a moment, Ethan seemed to weigh his words. Then, to her surprise, he answered. "A few years ago, I was a co-pilot on a long-haul flight. Routine, like any other. Until it wasn't." His voice remained steady, but there was something in his eyes, something haunted. "We hit an unexpected storm. Severe turbulence. The kind where you feel the plane isn't yours to control anymore." Sophie's breath caught. She had heard of incidents like that before. Pilots trained for worst-case scenarios, but sometimes, things still went wrong. Ethan continued. "My best friend was the captain. He didn't make it." Silence. A deep, suffocating silence. Sophie's chest tightened. "Ethan, I was promoted after that flight," he cut in. "Some called it a show of trust. To me, It felt like a punishment. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. You blame yourself. His jaw tightened. He was in command, but I was there. I should have. He stopped, exhaling sharply. It doesn't matter. But it did. She could see it in every part of him. The guilt, the weight he carried. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. Ethan, you're human. No one can control everything. He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. And then, before she could process it, he leaned in. The kiss was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable. A collision of unspoken words, of tension that had been building since the moment they met. His lips were warm, hesitant at first, then deepening as if he had finally allowed himself to feel something real. But just as quickly, he pulled away. This can't happen, he muttered, standing abruptly. His walls, which had barely cracked, slammed back into place. Sophie felt the sting of rejection, but more than that, she saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing again. Before she could say anything, Ethan turned and left. And Sophie was left with the taste of something unfinished. Sophie barely saw Ethan for the rest of the flight. He remained in the cockpit, and when the plane finally touched down in New York, he was the first to disembark. She should have let it go. He had made himself clear. But as she walked through the terminal, her heart pounded with the weight of everything unsaid. Laura caught up to her, nudging her lightly. Are you okay? You've been quiet. Sophie forced a smile. Just tired. But she wasn't tired. She was restless. Her shift was over, and she could have gone home. Instead, she found herself standing near the airport exit, watching as Ethan strode toward the staff parking lot. Without thinking, she called out, Ethan. He stopped but didn't turn immediately. When he finally faced her, his expression was unreadable. You ran, she said, stepping closer. Not just now, but from everything. His jaw tightened. Sophie, this isn't. Don't, she interrupted. Don't tell me this can't happen. I felt it, and I know you did too. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand. Then make me understand. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, something in him seemed to give way. I lost someone once, he admitted, his voice rough. And when I did, I promised myself I wouldn't get close to anyone again. Because if you don't let people in, you can't lose them. Sophie's chest ached at his words. That's not living, Ethan. That's surviving. He looked away, as if the truth of her words was too much to face. She took a step closer, her voice softer now. I don't know what this is between us. But I do know that if you keep pushing people away, you'll never really move forward. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his walls cracking, just slightly. Then, in a move that surprised even him, he reached for her hand. His grip was firm, but his touch was careful, almost as if he was afraid she'd disappear. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Sophie smiled, lacing her fingers with his. Then let's figure it out together. The airport buzzed around them, passengers coming and going, lives intersecting in fleeting moments. But in that instant, none of it mattered. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't running. He was choosing to stay.